Communication is an important part of life, and it would probably be important for fantasy creatures as well. And I'm not talking about languages, but rather the basic forms of communication, which is the first thing that you might want to consider, even if your ultimate goal is to actually create a new language for your creatures. So let's talk different communication strategies, how you convey and receive information through eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and what this might mean for the species as a whole. The first question is, what is the basis for the species communication? Is it audible, like human speech or bird song, dogs barking, whales singing? Is it maybe visual? See, for example, sign languages, body language in general. Maybe they have skin or fur or scales that change colors or texture. Maybe they communicate through dancing or by emitting light or by anything else that can be seen. It could, of course, also be telepathic, sent from one person to another or to a group via thought, or maybe it's something like a hive mind. Say everyone hears everyone's thoughts or feels everyone's emotions, or say they all share one mind, they all actually think the same thoughts and have the same emotions, with one or few individuals sort of leading the group in what they should be thinking or feeling. Or maybe the group is a mixture of everyone's feelings and thoughts and emotions. That would potentially create a very empathetic species where everyone works for the good of everyone because everyone literally suffers if one individual does. Another basic communication strategy could be scent, or it could be something tactile, touching each other in order to communicate. These are some basic communication strategies, and they're based largely on human senses, apart from maybe telepathy, but your species could also have a different sense that humans don't have that they use to communicate. Also remember that it's entirely possible and maybe even likely that your species uses more than one of these strategies to communicate. Humans, for example, communicate largely via speech, which is an audible way of communicating, but we're also very, very visual with facial expressions and body language and things like that, which doesn't even take into consideration things like sign language, which is entirely visual, or things like snuggles and hugs and kisses, which are tactile ways of communicating, as well as pheromones, which are based on scent, which, granted, we can't control our pheromones like that, but we can put on perfume, for example, and things like that to manipulate the scent-based communication that we have as well. The point is, mixing and matching is encouraged when it comes to figuring out how your creatures communicate. The next thing I want to talk about is what effect this basic communication strategy has on your creature's physiology and behavior. And strictly speaking, it's usually the other way around, that the physiology and biology of a creature impacts how they're able to communicate, but we are not as limited as nature is. We can start from a communication strategy that we like and build the physiology and behavior of the creature from that. So, how does their way of communication affect their physiology, or how does their physiology inform their communication strategies? If the communication is audible, for example, they probably have fairly good hearing, at least around the range that their communication takes place. If it's visual, they have good eyesight, or at least good enough eyesight for that specific form of communication. They might potentially be very sensitive to bright colors or light if that is part of how they communicate. If the communication is telepathic, you can do some very interesting things. They don't maybe need to have mouths, as long as you can figure out a different way for them to eat or absorb nutrients. They might also not need ears, in which case you need to figure out a different way for them to detect threats and things like that. Refer back to my video on survival for those kinds of things. If they communicate by scent, then they need to have a good sense of smell, and maybe they're sensitive to other smells than the ones they communicate with as well, which means that the smell of a newly introduced flower or creature or technology might disturb their communications, which is an important aspect to take into consideration no matter what the basic communication strategy is. They might be sensitive to new things that come in that disturb the way they hear or smell or see or whatever it is. If their communication is tactile, then obviously it requires some sort of proximity. They need to be able to touch each other. And if they don't have that proximity, say you have a sci-fi setting, maybe they have invented suits that can send and receive communications and simulate the tactile sensation even if the person you're communicating with is far away. And that is in general an interesting thing to take into consideration. If their primary way of communicating is impeded in some way, either by outside forces or by a disability of some sort, then what is the workaround? How do they use their secondary means of communication as their primary? Humans, for example, our primary way of communicating is audible, it's human speech. So if we for some reason can't speak to someone or hear them, say we have a disability, we are deaf or hard of hearing, or we are too far away, or we are underwater and sound doesn't travel, then we have developed other ways of communicating. We have developed sign language, and we have developed sign languages-ish that don't really work as full languages, but they work well enough for whatever you're doing underwater or when you have to be quiet or something like that. And we have also developed text, which goes into the next topic, which is leaving messages and or relaying information to the next generation. How does your species do this? If they do it at all, they might not actually want to do that or have to do that. But if they do, what kind of strategies do they have? And since this doesn't have to correspond to their normal way of communicating, again, we speak usually, but we can also write things down. That's audible and visual. You can play around with this. We know, for example, that audio doesn't stick around for very long, so outside of technological or magical ways of leaving audible messages, maybe it seems like a weird choice, but you could do something like leaving wind chimes up, or things that act like wind chimes that play specific tunes for specific threats or messages you want to leave. Could also be things like leaving, say, shells on the ground that give specific kind of crunch when you walk on them. And of course there is storytelling, which is an old form of leaving messages audible via story. Then there are visual messages, which we are pretty good at as humans. There is the written language as an option. You could also do marks that's not an alphabet, but specific marks in bark or rock or soil or whatever you have available. Footprints are a visual mark, as well as broken twigs or patterns of rocks and so on. Leaving messages with scent is also a fairly common one in our world. Maybe not with humans, but with other animals. It can involve rubbing against something to leave a scent. It can involve urine or the pheromone glands in a cat's paws, for example, among many other things. Tactile messages could involve something again like the wind chimes, like hanging specific things at specific heights, so that when you walk into them, you will feel that, okay, there's a threat here because I feel something to my right, or there's a whole kind of alphabet you could create there. There are also other options, of course, say leaving the ground smooth or non-smooth, depending on what kind of message you want to leave. And yeah, there are just many things you can do if you think about it. And I really do want to encourage you to think about these things, because communication is such a very important part of creating creatures. And there are so many ways to go that are not audible. And it's very easy to default, but if you want to create something unique, then this is an excellent topic to play around with. Also remember to take into consideration where the species live or where it evolved so that it needed this specific way of communication, as well as many other things that geography and evolution is going to affect, which we're going to talk about in the next video, so don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss that. Thank you for watching, be safe, I will see you next time.